Hello again, everybody. Lance Smith here, and welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. This is episode 254. You know, friends, one of the things I love about the Bible is that it feels real. And I know that may sound obvious, but think about it for a second. Real life is messy sometimes. Real geography is messy. Real memories are messy. People describe places differently depending on perspective, region, or context. And sometimes when modern readers come to the Bible, we expect ancient people to describe locations the way our phones do today. We expect GPS precision. We want exact coordinates, state lines, county markers, and maybe a nice blue dot on Google Maps saying, "You are here." But ancient writers didn't think that way. Today's Bible difficulty is one of those places where modern expectations collide with ancient geography. And once you understand that, the problem really starts to melt away. Here's the question. Was Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin or in the wilderness of Paran? Because depending on which verse you read, you get a different answer. Just a quick note before we jump in. We're dealing with some ancient place names that have tricky pronunciations. I've done my best to get them right, but feel free to cut me a little grace if I'm not perfect on every one. Okay, let's look at the passages together from the New Living Translation. Numbers 20, verse 1. In the first month of the year, the whole community of Israel arrived in the wilderness of Zin and camped at Kadesh. But then Numbers 13:26 says, Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. So which was it? Was Kadesh in Zin or was Kadesh in Paran? At first glance, it sounds contradictory. Skeptics have certainly pointed to it as one. And honestly, if you're just casually reading through Numbers, it can make you stop and scratch your head a little. Norman Geisler and Thomas Howell address this directly in the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. They summarize the issue this way. In this text, Numbers 20, verse 1, Kadesh is said to be in the wilderness of Zin, but in Numbers 13:26, it is said to be in the wilderness of Paran. Which was it? And then they offer several possible explanations, and I quote, First, some believe there were two places named Kadesh, one in each wilderness. Second, the name Kadesh could have been applied to both a city and a region in which the city lay. Third, that same city was positioned between two wildernesses so as to be appropriately associated with either. Back to me. Now, that's actually a very good summary of the main solutions scholars have proposed over the years. And today we're going to unpack those possibilities carefully. And I'll tell you up front where I personally land. I think the border region explanation makes the most sense. I think Kadesh Barnea sat in a transitional zone between these wilderness regions. And depending on the context, biblical writers could accurately associate it with either one. But before we get there, we need to understand just how important Kadesh was in Israel's story. Kadesh Barnea is one of the most significant locations in the wilderness wanderings. This wasn't some random campsite where Israel stopped for a snack break and kept moving. This place became a major staging area during the Exodus journey. The 12 spies were sent out from there. The rebellion after the spies' report happened there. The judgment of 40 years of wandering is connected to it. Miriam dies there. Moses strikes the rock there. Israel negotiates passage with Edom from there. Kadesh is woven all through this section of Scripture. And if you've ever traveled somewhere repeatedly, you know how people describe regions differently depending on the audience. For example, somebody might say, I live in Georgia, or I live in the South, or I live in Metro Atlanta, or I live in the Southeast. All of those can be true at the same time, and that's part of what's happening here. The most widely accepted explanation among many biblical geographers is that Kadesh Barnea sat near the boundary where the wilderness of Paran and the wilderness of Zin met or overlapped. And honestly, that makes perfect sense once you think about ancient deserts. Deserts don't usually come with giant signs saying, "Welcome to Zin, population, sand." These were broad, wilderness territories with loose boundaries. They blended into each other gradually. The wilderness of Paran was a massive desert region connected to the Sinai wilderness system. It stretched broadly across areas south and east of Kadesh. The wilderness of Zin appears farther north, extending toward Edom and the southern boundary of Canaan. Kadesh Barnea likely sat in a transitional zone between them. Numbers 33:36 explicitly says, "They left Ezion Geber and camped at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin." But elsewhere, especially in the earlier spy narrative, Kadesh is associated with Paran. That's not contradictory if the location sat near overlapping regional designations. It's similar to how people today sometimes debate whether certain U.S. states belong to the Midwest or the Mid-South. And if you've ever driven across the country, you know there's not always a dramatic dividing line. One moment you're in the rolling plains. A few minutes later, you're in foothills. Then suddenly mountains. No flashing light, no trumpet fanfare, no angel descending from heaven saying, "Congratulations, you've now entered a new geographical category." Regions blur together. Ancient writers described geography phenomenologically, meaning according to how places were experienced and understood, not according to modern cartography. And honestly, that gives the biblical text a ring of authenticity. If every description sounded like it came from satellite imaging software, that would actually feel less ancient, not more. Now, let's talk about the likely location of Kadesh Barnea itself. Most scholars today associate it with Ain el-Quderat, or nearby springs in the Qasim region. This oasis area contains multiple water sources: Ain Kundes, Ain el-Quderat, and nearby springs. And that matters because water in the desert is life. You don't lead a massive population through wilderness terrain without dependable water sources. These oasis regions naturally became gathering places, trade routes, encampments, and strategic locations. So Kadesh Barnea wasn't just important spiritually, it was important geographically. It sat at a crossroads. And crossroads locations often get associated with multiple surrounding regions. One thing I always want to do on this podcast is to show you that Christians aren't hiding from difficult questions. We can actually dig into the scholarship. We can examine the evidence, and we can look at competing views honestly. And when we do, I think Scripture consistently holds up remarkably well. One fascinating article is David Ben-Gad Hakohen's piece on thetorah.com called "Solving the Problem of Kadesh in the Wilderness of Paran." He explores how Jewish commentators over the centuries handled these passages. For example, Ramban, also known as Nachmanides, argues that Kadesh in Numbers 13 referred to Kadesh Barnea in Paran, while the Kadesh in Numbers 20 referred to a Kadesh in Zin. He specifically distinguished the two settings. Rashi and Ibn Ezra also recognize complexities in the geography. Now, I don't necessarily agree with every conclusion these commentators reach, but I appreciate the honesty of the discussion. These aren't modern skeptics inventing problems. Jewish scholars wrestled with these texts centuries ago because they took Scripture seriously. And sometimes Christians get nervous when they hear words like textual issues or source discussions. But examining the details doesn't weaken faith. In many cases, it strengthens it. Because real history is detailed, real places are complicated, real travelers describe terrain differently, and the Bible reflects that realism constantly. Now, Let's move into archaeology for a few minutes because this part gets really interesting. The strongest archaeological candidate for Kadesh Barnea is Tel Ekudeyrat. The Biblical Archaeology Society has an excellent article called Wilderness Wanderings, Where is Kadesh?, discussing the excavations there. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of significant occupation at the site, especially during the Iron Age. Now, critics sometimes say, well, we don't see evidence of 2 million Israelites camping there. But remember something important. Nomadic groups don't usually leave behind skyscrapers. If you go camping this weekend, future archaeologists probably won't excavate your campsite and discover a fully preserved Buc-ee's. Desert nomads leave limited material remains. What archaeology does show is that the oasis area was strategically important for a very long time because of its water supply. And that fits the biblical narrative extremely well. Israel Finkelstein, who is often more skeptical than conservative scholars, still acknowledges the significance of the site in his reevaluation titled Kadesh Barnea, a reevaluation of its archaeology and history. He notes major Iron Age occupation and recognizes the long-standing importance of the oasis. And again, that's exactly what we would expect. Where there's water in the desert, people gather. Even today, cities spring up around water access. Ancient people were no different. Honestly, sometimes when reading the wilderness narratives, I imagine the Israelites seeing those springs after days of travel. Can you picture it? Dust everywhere, livestock exhausted, kids complaining, probably somebody asking Moses for the 100th time, "Are we there yet?" And then suddenly, water, shade, relief. Kadesh mattered because survival mattered. The Bible.ca discussion on the wilderness of Paran also supports this border region understanding in my view as well. It notes that Paran lay south and east of Kadesh while Zin stretched north and east. That overlap explains why the same site could reasonably be connected with either wilderness. And Bible Mapper's recent article, Kadesh Barnea and its Surroundings, says something very helpful. It explains that Kadesh and its springs are essentially sandwiched between these regions, which naturally explains the dual descriptions in Scripture. That's not contradiction, that's geography. Now, let's fairly examine the other major interpretation. Some scholars and commentators believe there were actually two different places called Kadesh. This is called the two-site hypothesis. Under this view, one Kadesh, often identified as Kadesh Barnea, belonged to Paran and appears in the earlier narratives, especially the spy story in Numbers 13. The second Kadesh belonged to Zin and appears later in Numbers 20 during the 40th year of wandering. Some even connect the later site with a region near Petra, ancient Rechem. Josephus and some Jewish traditions associated Miriam's burial with the Petra territory. Supporters of this view argue that the long time gap between Numbers 13 and Numbers 20, nearly 38 years, may support the idea of two distinct locations. And to be fair, this view does solve the issue neatly. If there were two Kadeshes, there's no difficulty at all. Now, personally, I still lean toward the border region explanation because it seems simpler and fits the itinerary in Numbers 33 more naturally. But I want to be careful here. You don't need to prove the exact map coordinates of Kadesh in order to show there's no contradiction. Both explanations resolve the difficulty perfectly reasonably. Sometimes critics frame these discussions as, aha, the Bible contradicts itself. But the actual scholarly discussion is more like, which of these historically plausible explanations best fits the evidence? That's a very different conversation. And honestly, that happens in historical studies all the time. Historians debate exact routes, boundaries, and place identifications constantly. Nobody throws away all of Roman history because ancient writers described regional borders differently. Nobody dismisses the U.S. Civil War because one person described a battle as occurring in northern Georgia, while another described it as occurring in Appalachia. Context matters. Regional terminology matters. Perspective matters. And the Bible deserves the same fairness we give any other ancient historical text. Here's something interesting to think about. The Bible never pauses to explain the supposed problem. It simply uses the regional descriptions naturally. That's exactly what authentic historical writing often does. Fake stories tend to over-explain themselves. Real stories assumed shared cultural understanding. Ancient readers likely understood these regional overlaps intuitively, but modern readers, separated by thousands of years, often expect precision the original audience never demanded. And honestly, this happens in our own language too. If someone says, "I'm from Atlanta," they may actually live 30 to 60 minutes outside Atlanta. If another person says, "I'm from Georgia," they're not contradicting that first statement. Both are accurate descriptions from different levels of specificity. The Bible is doing something similar with wilderness terminology. And remember, these wilderness names describe enormous desert expanses, not fence subdivisions with official property markers. There's no HOA meetings in the wilderness of Paran, no county zoning commission in Zin, just large desert regions with transitional boundaries. And that's important because sometimes Bible difficulties sound bigger than they really are once we step into the ancient world. Now, before I wrap up, I want to say something kind of pastoral here because Kadesh isn't just a geography lesson. Kadesh became a place of testing, a place where Israel repeatedly struggled to trust God. The spies returned there with fear. The people rebelled there. Moses failed there in striking the rock. Miriam died there. Kadesh became associated with both provision and unbelief. And honestly, I think many Christians have their own Kadesh moments, places where God has already proven himself faithful, but fear still creeps in. Places where we know what God has done before, yet we still panic about the future. Israel saw miracle after miracle, the Red Sea, manna, water from rocks, pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, and they still struggle to trust. Now, before we judge them too harshly, we should probably admit we do the exact same thing. God answers prayers, provides unexpectedly, guides us through hard seasons, and then 6 months later, we're worrying ourselves sick again. At least I know I've done that. Maybe you have too. One reason I love the honesty of Scripture is that it never paints God's people as flawless heroes. The Bible tells the truth about human weaknesses. And yet, through all the rebellion, complaining, fear, and wondering, God remained faithful to his covenant promises. That's the real story of Kadesh. Not merely whether it sat in Zin or Paran, but that God sustained his people even in the wilderness. So let's answer today's question clearly. Numbers 21 places Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Numbers 13:26 places Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. Is that a contradiction? No. The two main explanations are, first, Kadesh sat near overlapping wilderness regions, allowing biblical writers to associate it with either Zin or Paran, depending on context. Second, there may have been two related locations called Kadesh. Either explanation resolves the difficulty without undermining the reliability of Scripture. And personally, I think the border region explanation fits ancient geography very naturally. What initially sounds contradictory turns out to reflect the complexity of real-world locations and authentic historical description. And honestly, friends, I think that's one of the reasons the Bible continues to endure scrutiny generation after generation. These texts were rooted in real places, real journeys, real failures, real people, and a very real God working through history. If today's episode helped you or encouraged you, or maybe cleared up a question you've wondered about for years, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com. You can also join the discussion on the Bible Difficulties and Answers Facebook page. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/Lance Smith. All episodes are archived at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com. Next Friday, we'll tackle another fascinating question from the same section of same section of Numbers, Numbers 20:21. How could this verse say Israel went around Edom when Deuteronomy 2:4 sounds like they passed through it? That's going to be a fun one. I'm Lance Smith, wishing you good health, good study, and God's richest blessings. So long, everybody.